When it comes to quadratics and their graphs, there's a lot of vocabulary involved. So let's go ahead and talk about it a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about the graph of a quadratic equation, which is a parabola. And that's more or less going to look something like this. Something very useful about parabolas is that if I draw a vertical line straight down through the middle of my graph, we can see that it's symmetric. I could picture folding my graph over that dotted line and it would match more or less. My graph is not perfect, but it would match from the left to the right. This is what we call our axis of symmetry. Now, in order for it to be the axis of symmetry, it has to go through the exact middle of your graph. More importantly, the point in the exact middle of your graph, it's either going to be the very low point like it is here, or maybe your graph is flipped over and it's actually the very top point. But that point is called our vertex. So your axis of symmetry must pass through that vertex. Another key characteristic of parabolas is the y-intercept, and that is where your graph crosses the y-axis. So that would be right about here for my graph. We have our zeros, which is another fancy name for the x-intercepts, and that is where your graph crosses the x-axis, and we usually have two of them. Sometimes you only have one of them, sometimes you have none of them, but these 2 points together, these are called your zeros. And then your max or your min comes from your vertex. And that says at some point your graph turns around. What is that very, very lowest point that it hits before it turns around? Or what is the high point that it hits before it turns around? Now in this case, my graph is facing upward, which means that there is a minimum value at my vertex. Now I haven't labeled my graph with any values, so I can't tell you exactly what that number is, but whatever that value for y is the minimum value. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at a parabola and we'll go through and find each of these things. So I've got this parabola here and I want to find first my axis of symmetry. I'll abbreviate that as AOS. Remember that your axis of symmetry is a vertical line that goes through the exact middle of your graph. So that would be this line right here. It goes through the exact middle and it is a vertical line, which means it has the equation x equals, and the x value that we're on is this number right here, which is super small, but that is a 1. So that vertical line is x equals 1. So my axis of symmetry is x equals 1. The second thing that we'll look at is finding our vertex. So your axis of symmetry goes through the vertex. The vertex is also the very, very bottom point of your graph when it faces upwards like mine does. So that would be this point here. The coordinates of that point are, we already know that it has an x value of 1 because it comes from the axis of symmetry, and the y value is -8. So my vertex then is the point 1, -8. I will now look at finding my y-intercept. My y-intercept is where my graph crosses the y-axis. So if I go to my y-axis and move up and down until I hit my graph, I find that we hit right here. And this point is 0 for x and -6 for y. So my y-intercept is the point 0, -6. Looking at my zeros, I need to find my x-intercepts on my graph. So now I'll go along the x-axis and look for the point where my graph hits. I see it hits here at -1 and here at +3. So I have two. Again, that's very common for parabolas. So I have one at -1 with a y value of 0 and 3, 0. So my zeros are -1, 0 and 3, 0. And we call them the zeros because they are the points where y is 0. The last thing we mentioned about parabolas is whether it has a max or a min and what that value is. In this graph, it faces upward. So if I go to my vertex, that is the very, very bottom of my graph. There's no going below that vertex. So this graph has a minimum value, and the value is whatever point it hits at its very, very lowest. So here is that minimum. I'm looking for the y value that we hit. What is the the lowest we go, and the lowest that we go is -8, meaning that my minimum value is -8. And that's a little bit about parabolas. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.